Good afternoon. I'm Warren Hogue, IPI's Senior Advisor for External Relations, and I'm happy to welcome you to this event in our SRSG Series, focusing on Lebanon and the impact of the Syrian crisis there. Now, I know you expected to find IPI President Terje Rood-Larsen seated in this chair, but he had a last-minute summons to Europe on Monday, and I know he's particularly sorry to miss this meeting since he actually works with our guest in Terje's role as the Secretary General's envoy for the Lebanon-related Security Council Resolution 1559. Our guest today is Derek Plumbly, the Secretary General's Special Coordinator for Lebanon since February of 2012. We started this SRSG series in 2006, and it is, to my mind, one of the most important things we do at IPI because it brings people from posts far from UN headquarters with real first-hand, on-the-ground, eyewitness experience into personal contact with the diplomatic and policy community based here in New York. And, of course, it brings us the invaluable opportunity of hearing directly from them. I have a particular appreciation for these events because, as some of you know, I spent much of my life as a newspaper foreign correspondent. So I consider these meetings to be like dispatches from the front. The series has focused on places of staggering challenges for the UN, among them Liberia, Syria, Central African Republic, and Chad, Sudan, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Burundi, Guinea-Bissau, Haiti, the Palestinian territories, Afghanistan, Libya, Iraq, Somalia, and most recently, Mali. Today, we are turning our attention to the extensive role of the UN in Lebanon. The Office of the United Nations Special Coordinator for Lebanon, known as UNSCOL, is the political office of the United Nations that coordinates the work of the UN in the country. Following the withdrawal of the Israeli Defense Forces from South Lebanon in May 2000, Lebanon experienced continual instability, prompting the UN to set up this political presence in Beirut to support international efforts to maintain peace and security. By February 2007, in the aftermath of the July 2006 war, the mandate of the Secretary General's representative was expanded to cover activities all over Lebanon and to achieve greater coherence in the UN's work throughout the country. I had personal experience with the UN in Lebanon at that time because as the New York Times correspondent covering the UN, I accompanied Kofi Annan on his trip there in August of 2006. And we helicoptered over the blue line on the Israeli border that just days earlier had been a theater of war. There were many disturbing sights from the air, including bombed villages and sundered bridges and deeply cratered roads, and a forlorn hilltop outpost that I will never forget because 4 unarmed UN observers had been killed there in an airstrike. But one sight of a less life and death gravity sticks in my mind because it represented to me so poignantly the continually dashed hopes in Lebanon of a return to some kind of normalcy. The sight was rows and rows of empty poolside deck chairs along the coast, put there by hotel and resort owners in the hope, as that summer had begun, that they would be occupied by tourists. Such is the deepening UN involvement in Lebanon that I was back there again in 2007 with a new Secretary General, Ban Ki-moon, as he visited what was already a vastly expanded UN presence in the country. Today, while UNSCOL's work focuses largely on the implementation of Security Council Resolution 1701, that was the August 2006 resolution that called for a permanent ceasefire between Israel and Lebanon, UNSCOL also monitors political developments, promotes dialogue, and provides overall political guidance to the multifaceted UN presence in the country. Did I say multifaceted? I went on the UNSCOL website this morning and counted 24 different UN organizations working in Lebanon. Now Lebanon finds itself at the heart of the Syrian conflict. On the humanitarian side, over 1 million Syrian refugees live in the country. That amounts to 22% of the population of the country. And the World Bank estimates that that number will grow to 1.6 million by the end of 2014. And given the absence of refugee camps in Lebanon, the refugees have to be integrated into Lebanese society. On the political front, the violence in Syria is intertwined with sectarian dynamics in Lebanon. Hezbollah's active participation in support of the Alawite regime in Damascus has provoked various Sunni elements, bringing pre-existing sectarian tensions in Lebanon to a boiling point. The spillover of violence continues to manifest itself, particularly in the wave of car bombings that have rocked Beirut in recent months, as well as continued street fighting in the northern city of Tripoli. These factors have put enormous strain on the already faltering Lebanese economy, particularly a decline in trade and tourism revenues and an overall loss in business and consumer confidence. According to a recent World Bank report, government expenditure will have to grow by $1.1 billion to meet the surging demand for public services, including health, education, water, and electricity. The UN's role and presence in Lebanon at this volatile moment is therefore all the more crucial, which is why we feel very fortunate to have Derek Plumbly with us today. You have his full biography there in your papers. Let me note just the highlights. He has been chair of the Assessment and Evaluation Commission charged with monitoring implementation of the Comprehensive Peace Agreement in Sudan. And he has also served as the UK's ambassador to Egypt and to Saudi Arabia, and as director of the Middle East and North Africa in the Foreign Office. Derek, we're grateful you're here, and we look forward to hearing from you. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Warren. Can you hear me too? Yeah, good. Okay. Well, thank you. When I first began to think about this, or when I thought about it, it was actually 3 years to the day since the start of the what became a civil war in Syria. And what I thought, the first thought that came to mind really was just, and others have said it, but it's worth restating at the beginning, the extraordinary will of the Lebanese, of Lebanon and the Lebanese to survive, and their resilience, because that seems to me to be a very big story out of all of this. And they have achieved a relative degree of success, more, I think, than most people who know the region would have thought possible in actually sustaining a measure of stability in their country while these events are going on in a country which is so closely linked to Lebanon next door. So that was the first thought that came to mind. But then, I mean, the other thought that came to mind was that actually in the past few months, but every month that passes, but I think in sort of 4-month phases, because I come and report to the Security Council every 4 months, that in the past 4 months, the threats have become more acute. They've crowded in. And of course, there isn't any particular end in sight to the conflict in Syria. So this business of keeping Lebanon safe, which is in the minds, I think, of so many people in Lebanon, and it's what the United Nations is concerned with, Lebanon's stability, Lebanon's security, becomes a heavier task. What I thought I would do, and Warren's stolen a bit of my thunder, but I will do it nonetheless, is to describe the scene there in Lebanon, the challenges as they seem to me. But your assessment is very accurate, I have to say, and how we and the Lebanese themselves have responded to it. And just a little bit about what is going to need to be done in the immediate future. My crystal ball is, as always, it's pretty murky, but I will do my best to look at a little bit further ahead. But I defer to the expertise of many in the audience who are deep experts in matters Lebanese, so I look forward to the discussion afterwards. Take as my starting point, though, actually I think I should, because it's where my mission started, which is Resolution 1701, which is the one that was put in place at the end of the 2006 war. And it seems to me that it's worth just remembering the trauma and the apocalyptic nature of that conflict, because we're talking about problems which have grown gradually, and challenges which have become gradually more severe. But that was an event which just consumed Lebanon, stability in the area virtually overnight. And certainly it is important, even as we think about the impact of the Syrian crisis, to remember that sustaining what has been now 7 years, more than 7 years of calm across the blue line is a very important element in actually sustaining a measure of stability in Lebanon. And I think the arrangements that 1701 put into place, UNIFIL, the strengthened mandate and so on, has been key, really, to keeping things in that part of the country and across the blue line stable. And its contrasts, of course, with the turmoil that you see in the region more generally and the other pressures that exist on Lebanon. But it's important. But there, too, I have to say, we have seen more by way of incidents in the last few months than I personally would wish. Now, they've been managed by UNIFIL very well, and I think on the part of the parties, all of the people concerned, there is a concern basically to keep things stable, to keep things as they are. But it does require eternal vigilance. It requires a lot of hands-on attention through the tripartite mechanism and so on, which has worked so far. But with the incidents of the past couple of months, you need to be at least aware of the risk of miscalculation when things happen. And some of the stuff happens actually outside UNIFIL's area of operations. I'm thinking of the strike that was reported by the government of Lebanon, inside Lebanon, just a few weeks ago, and the threats that came after that. So it's very important, I think, to encourage the parties both to avoid anything which could precipitate escalation in that area, and to encourage them to move forward. I mean, we have an agenda, things which haven't been done, which need to be done, outstanding obligations, and a goal which is a sort of permanent ceasefire up there on the horizon, and we shouldn't lose sight of it, I think. Anyway, all of that said, the headlines, ever since I've been in Lebanon, in 2 years or more now, have really almost always related to something else, which is the impact, as Warren said, of the Syrian crisis on Lebanon. That impact has been profound, notwithstanding the resilience I was talking about, but profound in at least three areas. I mean, the sort of economic, social, humanitarian one, which Warren focused on, security, and the politics of the country. All three areas have been deeply affected by the Syrian crisis. With regard to the first, the humanitarian and the social and economic consequences of the humanitarian crisis, the figures speak for themselves, and Warren mentioned them. We're pushing, I mean, sometime in the next 2 or 3 weeks, we will have 1 million refugees probably actually seeking assistance, Syrian refugees seeking assistance from the United Nations. You have 1 million already seeking assistance from the United Nations if you include the Palestinians who have fled from Syria, who have come to Lebanon. So the figure is there. And that is, as you said, Warren, is over 20% increase in population in 2 years, just over 3 years. And means that Lebanon has more refugees per capita than any other country in the world. There's a higher density of refugees in Lebanon than there is anywhere else in the world. And they're spread, as everybody knows, across the country in every district, but with a particular concentration. And we say, UNHCR talk of 1,600 districts in Lebanon where there are refugees. They mean essentially municipalities. Of them, over 200 are classified as being particularly vulnerable, because of the poverty of the resident population already. And those are areas, I mean, these are areas which are vulnerable in that sense, and vulnerable because they have a particularly high density of refugees. It means in the far north, in the Akkar, in the Bekaa, this is where the pressure is felt most. And where the pressure is greatest on shelter and it's greatest on education, least likely to be available because the schools by now will be full with the public schools. With Syrian children, as well as the Lebanese. And Warren mentioned the World Bank assessment, which we encouraged in August last year. World Bank the UN country team and the government of Lebanon worked on it and produced this assessment in the summer of last year, and said that he'd noticed when he was there in a previous context, and after 2006, the empty poolside chairs. Well, if you look now, you see the empty poolside chairs, and you see the empty downtown area of Beirut and the restaurants that are closing. And these are symptoms, very visible symptoms, of what the World Bank and their colleagues found, which is zero growth and a heavy impact over the past 2 years, over the 2-year period they were looking at. It projects forward into this present year, and a very heavy impact on government finances. You mentioned the additional costs, but if you look at loss of revenue too, the estimate is $2.6 billion in that 2-year period for a very small country. I mean, a country with a population equivalent to what in this country might be a large municipality, maybe. I mean, that's a slight exaggeration, but a city anyway. And the pressures that are attendant on that, on the public services, on health and education, I mean, these are all reflected too in that assessment. And, you know, you have to say to yourself, I mean, the Lebanese have been extraordinarily generous. This is the term. It upsets some people in Lebanon when you talk about this or commend their generosity, and I can understand why. But it is an extremely creditable record, basically. There are 1 million refugees there, and more coming in, and waves coming in when you have incidents, as we had recently, I'll talk about it, but the events around Arsal and in the Bekaa, the fall of Kalamoun or the fall of Crac de Chevalier in the north, you get more people coming in, flows of people, and amongst them wounded, and they are admitted. No question but that they are admitted. So that's all there, but you must expect that the welcome will wear thin. I mean, the voices are there too, the people who call for the closure of borders. I mean, impossible in itself, but making it more difficult. The people who warn of tensions at ground level, particularly in these communities which are very hard pressed, where, like Arsal, you will have way over the majority now refugees. So the pressures are very real, and they will become more acute and actually make the humanitarian experts call it, the asylum space, the availability, the welcome, more difficult to deliver. So, economic and social consequences, heavy economic consequences, risk of tensions, and a risk of the humanitarian welcome being squeezed, at the very least, frankly. And in parallel with that, if you look at the security situation, and you can link the insecurity directly to what is happening, I think, in almost every case, to what has been going on in Syria. You have the recurrent violence in cities, but particularly Tripoli. And the last round of violence, in which 28 people died, lasted for 2 weeks almost, and was just that little bit more severe than the previous one. The army gets on top of it, but it's a repeat event, and when it happens, it has a paralyzing effect on that city. We've had, as Warren mentioned, the return of, he didn't mention the return of political assassination, and the assassination of Mohammed Shatta, which was one of the very disturbing events of the past few months period. But he did mention the terrorist bombings, the suicide bombings, of which there have been 9 since the Iranian embassy was attacked in, when was it, September last year? November, thank you. Yes, it was in the 3 months from November to February that these suicide bombings have taken place. And claimed by extremist groups, ISIS and Nusra, an AQ affiliate locally, the Abdullah Azam brigades, all of them linking what had happened to Hezbollah's fighting in Syria and so on. That's their justification, or the message they give to explain these things, shocking attacks. And in recent weeks, as I mentioned, the war has come closer, and the other element in the insecurity is the pressure on the border. And that has gone on with incursions and cross-border shelling and incidents and the movement of people and so on. And peaked a little bit again in the past week or so because of the fall of Yabrud and what was going on in Kalamoun and what was going on in the north as well. All of this has put an enormous pressure on the security forces, I have to say. I mean, on the Lebanese armed forces, on the security forces generally. They have taken losses. They are overstretched, under-equipped. Nonetheless, they have responded when things flare up. I mean, they sent a brigade to Arsal in this last few days in order to contain the situation there, which was vital, actually, I think, given the pressures, the air raids from Syria and so on. And they've had successes in disrupting the terrorism to some extent. I mean, serious successes, which in any other country, I think, would be big headlines in terms of the arrests that have been made. And in political terms, we've talked about the economic, the social, the political, as security, the political as being the other area, that we've had, as all this has gone on, a polarization and also a growth in extremism, reflecting the tensions between the communities, inevitably. And the authority of the state consequently challenged on the borders, in the cities, and political institutions, which anyway have had deadlines that they've had to deal with. I mean, the extension of the parliament last year, the resignation of the McCarthy government and the need to find a successor, and the 11 months that took. And now we have the presidential elections ahead. I mean, all of this would be a really, really enormous challenge in any country, it seems to me, in a country as fragile as Lebanon, and as vulnerable as Lebanon. These are immense challenges. And I have said, we have said from the beginning that we must do everything we can, everything in our power, to try to keep Lebanon marginally safe in these circumstances. But it does bear asking, at least given the scale of the investment, why? And why do we sort of care so much? Why do we try so hard? Or why is there that imperative? And one is, it seems to me, Lebanon's diversity, its sort of freedom, its sort of specialness in the region. But you wouldn't sell the case just on that. Another is the extent of the UN engagement already, which Warren described, the Security Council resolutions, the scale of the presence, the threat to regional peace and security if actually Lebanon does get drawn into the conflict in Syria, the spread of extremism which would occur if that happened, and the cost afterwards of having done nothing about it. And then, I mean, a real moral obligation. And if you look at the scale of the refugee issue, the 1 million refugees that Lebanon is looking after, and think, I mean, this really is a burden that must be shared. This isn't a burden that can be laid upon Lebanon alone. The good news is that the Security Council has been, commendably and consistently united in taking the view that Lebanon is important and that these challenges need to be addressed. And they produced a presidential statement in July last year with very strong political messages about support for Lebanon, support for its disassociation policy, the policy which designed to keep it out of the conflict, the Babda Declaration, which is a broader expression of that, which was agreed in the national dialogue, support for President Suleiman, who was the author of that and has been a sort of a strong voice for Lebanon's stability and security and the continuity of state institutions. And in parallel said, we have these 3 areas where Lebanon really specifically needs to be supported. That is to say, the needs of the army, for the reasons that I've described and the extent to which it's crucial to holding the country together and some multi-confessional nature of it, but its security role. Support for the army, assistance with the refugees, and support for the institutions of the state, the municipalities, the host communities, and so on, as they try to deal with the impact of the Syrian crisis. All of that was in the conclusions that we drew here in New York in September last year, when the Secretary General convened the foreign ministers of the P5 and Secretary General of the Arab League and the EU to look at this and created what was called the International Support Group for Lebanon. And the support group was supposed to sort of cast a light on the needs as well as sort of providing an ongoing platform for the political messaging. And they met again in Paris, as you probably know, on the 5th of this month, at a similarly high level, I mean, with Mr. Lavrov and Mr. Kerry and all of the other foreign ministers, many more on this occasion. I mean, Saudi Arabia was represented, other European governments, because of things that they were doing to support Lebanon, were invited too. And the messages were reiterated with an update to reflect the new political situation. I know I've sort of talked on a bit, but it would be worth saying just a little bit about where we are on these different agendas, just to you can give us, you can tick the box and say, did they do it, did they succeed, did they fail, or whatever. As to the Lebanese, I defer to the ambassador here on this occasion, but they succeeded triumphantly just before the meeting, in the sense that the 11 months of waiting produced an excellent outcome with the appointment of Tamam Salam and his government, which answered one of the biggest asks of the international community in these statements that I'm referring to, which is we need an empowered government. We need a partner for all these assistance mechanisms that people are putting in place in the United Nations on the ground and UNIFIL and UNHCR and all the rest of it. But you need it, O Lebanese, and people had said that. Well, the empowered government was formed. And it was not just an empowered government, it was an inclusive government, you know, with everybody from Hezbollah all the way through to the Future Movement. And I think both an appropriate response, not for me to say so, but a wise response in a way, and that was perhaps was the driver to all the pressures, the security pressures and other pressures that I've described, despite the differences that exist. Everybody made concessions, they came together. And just to make the point, it was a deal made in Lebanon, because every Lebanese always says, you know, it must have been this or that, or, you know, but not true. This was done locally, I believe. So that happened, and after our meeting in Paris, the government finally agreed a ministerial statement, which is a program, which is good on issues like security and refugees and so on, very helpful, adopts all the ISG conclusions about and programs. It's in place, it's there for a limited period, but we'll come to that. On the other support agendas, as opposed to the political one, we tried very hard, and I must say, at the beginning it was a little bit like sort of, English would say, walking through treacle, difficult to get the necessary additional assistance for the army, for example, although existing donors increased what they were doing, particularly on the border, which is important, given what we've just been saying. But out of nowhere, or out of somewhere, the initiative in part of President Suleiman, we had the generous offer from Saudi Arabia, worked with France, and that will make a significant difference. And in follow-up to that, and sort of as part of the international umbrella, and in order to ensure that everything is well coordinated, there will be a further gathering, but specifically about support for the army, and you know, where are the gaps and so on with all this happening, and how do you coordinate the flow in Rome on the 10th of April, which is a preparatory meeting for what will then be a high level. This is an expert meeting. So they're on track, alhamdulillah. But the need has been defined, and the response is very much there. In terms of support for refugees, I mean, you will hear people say, "Where is it? You know, it's not happening." I mean, the United Nations spent $1 billion last year on assistance for refugees in Lebanon, but the numbers keep on growing and kept on growing through the year. But that is an awful lot of money. It's money that finds its way into the Lebanese economy in some parts because they don't, for example, feed people in camps, you know, with UN food parcels imported from elsewhere. They give a refugee family vouchers, which they then go and cash in Lebanese shops. So there is this is a much more integrated operation. So the scale of assistance was great. Its growth was enormous. If you look at UNICEF, for example, before the crisis, their investment in Lebanon, if that's the right phrase, was $3 million a year. In 2013, it was $130 million. I mean, these are not insignificant sums, but the need is enormous. And we struggle, basically, to catch up, to meet the requirement, particularly as the refugee presence, some of them have been there for a time, and the needs, the educational needs, the health needs grow. There's virtually no provision for secondary health care, for example, very little anyway. So these are really pressing concerns, all driven by, well, significantly driven anyway, by the need for additional funding. This year in Kuwait, the ask was enormous, $1.7 billion for Lebanon alone. And so far, I have to say, we've got 14% of what we need. So you can see why things could look more difficult during the course of the present year, unless there is some extraordinary pickup. And support for the government and host communities, which was the third of these three packages, and I'll shut up in a minute. We are, I think, and where there has been real progress is in a shared understanding of the need. The regional response plan envisages that 25% of what is raised of that 1.7 billion will actually have impact, be directed to host communities, government programs, and so on. So that's very significant. In addition to that, partly as a result of the stimulus of the ISG, of the International Support Group, mechanisms have been put in place which make possible additional support, I think, for government programs and directly to the government. A roadmap for stabilization, which was worked up by the whole of the country team with the World Bank, which sets out both immediate programs and, because this is a crisis which has longer-term development effects as well, medium-term and longer-term needs and projects which can be met, and a multi-donor trust fund which enables those governments, and the United States, for example, the European Union wouldn't go that way. They would do it more directly, but enables governments that are interested in supporting directly the government, but are not presently happy to do so without some additional governance arrangement, to assist directly government finance. And that really was sort of activated in Paris. But in all these things, you do need a government partner, and we need a government decision. And it was activated in the sense that Finland, France, Norway, the World Bank itself put money into the fund. But you need government decisions. We now have a government, and the ministerial statement is very clear about the activation of these programs immediately, basically, hoping for the first government meeting or thereafter. And then, of course, we will have to sort of shake that tree. And this is a very difficult time with many other asks basically out there. But it's important that people be pressed because the need is real. Just on final word on the politics. I mean, we have a government. As I said, it's a government for a short period because actually in law, when a new president is elected, a new government needs to be appointed. And the priority now, of course, is to actually get a new president elected. The period for presidential election started yesterday. And we have a 2-month period in which the Parliament can churn around until such time as they can identify a candidate who will command sufficient votes. That should happen by the 25th of May. I don't know whether it will, obviously, but I think you'd have to say that the ability of the various political parties, almost all of them, to come together in a government does at least give you some reason for hope that the goal is attainable, that it can be done. If your government can be formed, if the need is felt, the need additionally for a president, I think, in order to sustain this sort of institutions of the state and to support stability is self-evident. And certainly Prime Minister Salam, very clear in his message that this is the absolute priority, is delivering a successful presidential election within the time frame. And for us, that's the message. I mean, again, just to say it again, these are Lebanese processes. I mean, you described our role as being sort of, animating and so on, but it's animating in the sense of delivering the message, I think, from the Security Council, through the ISG, the Friends of Lebanon generally, that it's really important that these goals are met, that a president is elected in the time frame, that after that parliamentary elections are held. I mean, think what a signal it sends, you know? I mean, that Lebanon in these circumstances can achieve these things. But the reverse is also true, and it's therefore it's really worth, I think, giving our Lebanese friends encouragement on this path. I think that's enough, isn't it, really? I think that we should allow time for questions. I've gone on.
I was looking at you out of interest for what you were saying, not to persuade you not to keep talking. I've got a couple of questions.
I think just in the longer term, all I would say is this is going to go on. You can't look for sort of marvelous or remarkable changes out of Lebanon at the present moment, but just keeping things safe, on course, institutions in place, capable of dealing with the challenges that arise because they are empowered. It's absolutely crucial, and standing with them as they do so and delivering on these various sort of support agendas is enormously important. That's the priority. Sorry there, Warren. Yeah.
I'll just keep it going with a couple of questions, particularly in the refugee situation.
Yeah.
Derek, I want to discuss with you a little bit the non-camp strategy.
Yeah.
The FAFO Foundation did a study or talked to Lebanese and found that 70% of the Lebanese they spoke to expressed the wish that the UN set up camps as they have in Jordan and in Turkey, but as you all know, they do not have in Lebanon. And I know it's not something that the UN can sort of take a position on, but my colleague Mona Christopherson, who did a study for FAFO in northern Lebanon, has written a piece for our Global Observatory website feature that I commend to you. And it talks about how in the beginning, Lebanese actually welcomed or, found places for Syrian refugees to stay. But that the numbers have grown so immense now that they're no longer really able to do that, that there are Syrians who are competing with Lebanese for jobs. That sets up a terrible tension, terrible problem. And I wanted to ask you, does the UN, is it able to have a position on the non-camp strategy versus the camp strategy? Or is that something that the Lebanese decide and you have to operate within that context?
Well, I mean, it's for the Lebanese to decide, and we operate within the context. That's obviously true. Yeah. But equally, UNHCR, and I'm not the humanitarian specialist, but I know their view and I share it, have a view. I mean, it's a complex issue. I mean, on the whole, the UNHCR view would be that it's probably better for Lebanon and better for refugees to be in communities rather than concentrated in one or two very large camps. Many very large camps, if you actually think about the number of refugees that there presently are in Lebanon. The statistics, and there's a but there. I mean, the statistics that you mentioned, you talk about 70% of people wanting camps. There's another 70% figure. I mean, 70% of refugees presently actually live in rented accommodation, which doesn't mean a nice flat for most of them. It means they're sharing a room, two families, or whatever. You've seen them in sort of pretty grim circumstances, or a garage, or a bit of a balcony that's been walled in, and then you get two families in there, probably, and then some access to some sort of shared facility somewhere else. It's grim. I mean, yes, when I first went to look at refugees, they were being looked after by their families, by the families that stretch across the border in Wadi Khalid or whatever. It's not like that now. So the pressures are very great, I think, on shelter, and they're so great that the UN would say that you do need to be able to ease the pressure by having what they call transit sites, essentially, which would not be for a Zaatari 100,000 people or whatever, but to take the pressure off a town like Arsal, for example. I mean, it really does need some sort of local site in a safe place. I mean, that's the important thing. But the issue becomes not so much the resistance to the principle, but what the English would call not in my backyard. So it's very difficult to determine where you will put it. And then you get into a further debate about some people would say, all right, not in our yard at all, but just across the border or deeper into Syria. But then you get into issues of safety and security, which are very, very difficult. I mean, all these things need to be addressed. They need to be discussed. Shelter is you can just write that, the crisis headlines. Shelter is a really serious issue at the present moment. Education is a really pressing one, actually, if you think of the number of Syrian children who are not receiving any form of education. Health I've identified as well. So all of them need to be addressed, but shelter is pressing. And the new government, I have to say, for a short time, they're, probably there for 2 months. Inshallah, they are, just for 2 months, but very focused on this and really incredibly sort of actively discussing it, trying to find what the right balance is. I'm really on the shelter issue in particular.
When you mentioned a moment ago that the Lebanese military is overstressed, under-resourced, is that something the UN can get involved with? Is that outside the mandate of UNIFIL, for instance?
Well, it is, of course. I mean, I'm repeatedly asked by people in Lebanon, why can't UNIFIL deploy people to the eastern or the northern border or both? And I mean, the answer is it requires a change in the mandate, requires a decision. I'm going to lose this. I can see I'm becoming vulnerable. Can
Michael
you,
will come to your
rescue me and then. That's one answer. I mean, another answer is it's not why they were deployed in the first place, and the troop contributing countries would have a strong view. A third answer is, is it the right thing to do anyway? And all these are legitimate questions. The real answer, and where we are very much involved, I mean, another answer would have to be, actually, UNIFIL is carrying a heavier burden now in the south, because the Lebanese army is down to 2 brigades in the south. I mean, I said they'd had to deploy last week an extra brigade to Arsal. They've been deploying troops out to look after the situations in the cities on other parts of the border consistently in recent months, and they need to. We understand that. But that means to say that UNIFIL has to take on more patrolling in the south. But all of that, there's a many-sentenced answer to a question to which the answer is actually, briefly, the right answer is to empower and enable the Lebanese army to manage the border more effectively. And one of the areas where I think if you look at it, you'll find, I mean, I know it's certainly not perfect, and the porosity of the border is evident from recent events. But one of the areas where there has been real progress has been with assisting the Lebanese army with observation towers, logistics support, mobility on the border. That's been one of the headlines out of this. Let's get more support for the Lebanese army in the past few months. So, and that's our answer, basically. I mean, we are involved, we are interested, my office specifically, in ringing the alarm bell about the needs of the Lebanese army and getting more help. And that has produced some results on the border in terms of their capabilities. And that is the answer, not the UN one, I'm afraid.
Excellent. Yeah. I'd love to get some questions from the floor. Just raise your hand. I'll take 3 at once. I've got all IPI people here, but I'll start with Jose, and then Omar in the back, and then Udo here. We'll take 3 questions at once, Derek,
okay,
if you would
fine.
just make notes and then answer them all afterwards.
Do my best.
Yes, Jose Vericat from IPI. I'm an advisor here.
So would you stand up? It'd be easier for people in the back to hear.
Yes,
Thank
Jose Vericat. I'm an advisor here at IPI. I was wondering whether, I mean, it's evident that the war in Syria it divides Lebanon.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you would agree that had such a crisis taken place in the mid-1970s, it would have provoked a civil war, and if you think it would have, what has changed since then? Why is it not provoking a civil war today?
Yeah.
You can just guard that thought.
Yes,
Omar in the back.
Omar Alokta, a policy analyst here at IPI. Similar to Jose's question, but not about the past, more about the future. A lot of what we read about now is kind of scenario-based thinking for Syria. And one of the more grim scenarios is a kind of Balkanization taking place there, or for a more kind of sensationalist headline, the kind of liquidation of a post-Sykes-Picot Middle East. In such a scenario, what would the impact be for Lebanon, basically, or on Lebanon? Thank you.
And then finally, Udo Jans here, if you would.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and thank you to both of you, actually, for setting the stage and for spending so much time on refugees. My name is Udo Jans. I work for the High Commissioner for Refugees here in New York. You're right, of course.
Just introduce yourself.
My name is Udo Jans from the High Commissioner for Refugees here in New York. You are right, of course, that you would not be surprised that the High Commissioner will pronounce globally a preference for non-camp settings. That is clearly the preferred option. But of course, it's easier said than done in a situation such as the one we just heard about. Over 1 million people to be accommodated outside of a regular camp structure, and to reach out to them and provide the necessary assistance is a challenge that doesn't come easy. Yesterday, I saw the news coming out of Tripoli that a mother of 4 who had queued in a registration center for 3 days to get her food rations renewed attempted self-immolation by dousing herself with gasoline in front of her children because she was getting so desperate after 3 days of attempting to get her food rations replenished that she did what she felt she had to do. This is now the kind of increasing tension that I think, Derek, you referred to, because the situation is getting very desperate. Clearly, our office alone has spent $1 billion last year on the Syrian crisis, not counting all the other agencies together. And it clearly has reached a point where you could legitimately ask, how long can Lebanon be such a generous host with the impact that it has had? You referred to the World Bank study. I would be interested, actually, and perhaps you can share a couple of points with the audience as to what has happened in terms of the implementation of that study. I mean, is there something concrete that we can point to? Are there clear priorities that are being covered, that are being invested in? This is a joint venture that goes way beyond humanitarian assistance, obviously. The kind of burden sharing that you talked about is really something that the High Commissioner has been supporting from the very beginning. Burden sharing in the sense of taking urgent medical cases out of Lebanon, the most vulnerable of the vulnerable to be transferred to Europe or further beyond, wherever we can get the kind of humanitarian asylum, at least pending a review of the situation. And lastly, we need to do something, because if the asylum space is shrinking further, we will see further death on the high seas, as it already happens again in the sailing season that is starting for Lampedusa. And the figures rescued last week speak for itself. If we don't do anything, people will be pushed to take the boats, and of course the traffickers will benefit from that. So on all of those issues, I would be happy if you could elaborate a bit. Thank you.
Derek, could you answer those 3, and then we'll take 3 more.
Okay, well, in answer to Jose's question, very briefly, I was there in the 1970s, actually. That was my last incarnation in Lebanon as a student. And I think what's changed is that the civil war happened. I mean, it's glib, but I think people are very conscious of just how appalling it will be if they go over the edge. And that, I think, does actually sort of give a measure of restraint and constraint. I mean, there must be 101 other differences, but I would take that as a headline, at least worth remembering. And it does help. It helps to feed that resilience and the sort of will to survive that I described. And there must be more, but that is part of it. And as to Omar's question, I'm not really... I mean, Syria falls apart literally into statelets. I don't think it's going to happen quite like that, but I'm not an expert on Syria, how it will go. I think it's turbulence in Syria, whatever the form of the turbulence, but it won't change in the sense of this little Lebanese will to hold together and keep Lebanon as it is. A decisive tilt in Syria with the outcome, that one side or the other is the victor, then that obviously will have an impact. But if you're looking at sort of continuing competition within Syria, then I mean, really what I'm sort of anticipating is that Lebanon, through that period, until there is a political solution, which is what we must all strive for, will have to, I say will have to, I think we'll actually want to keep itself safe. That's the evidence of my 2 years there anyway. As to Udo's observations, I mean, the lady actually burnt herself, as I believe, because she was no longer entitled to food vouchers, which it gives you another sort of understanding of the complexity of all of this. I mean, UNHCR have had to decide who are the most vulnerable, and her family was out of it. So it was the procedure of coming back, of appealing, that led to this terrible incident, but just shows the pressures that people are under. You asked whether there are concrete results. Actually, what I was trying to say when I was talking about the response to the World Bank assessment, the joint assessment, and to the original ISG meeting on the 25th of September, was that we have put in place, there are concrete things in the shape of a program, a roadmap with projects identified and so on by the previous government, and this now adopted by this one, hopefully, and they will take it forward, and a trust fund. And there is money flowing into some projects. I've seen them in the Bekaa. I've seen a sort of, in one place, several projects in the Bekaa which are to benefit the local community. Waste plant, vehicles, a water delivery system. Similarly in Akkar, but it hasn't delivered in the sums or the quantity that I would wish yet. And what I'm saying is, with these mechanisms in place and a government which has endorsed them, we now have to have a really big push. The other way in which it actually has had its impact is that the whole debate has changed as a result of that assessment. We were there first in Lebanon ahead of the even Jordan, which is often talked about, has been much more, in some ways, generously assisted, or more generously assisted, given the sort of proportions, the numbers. And that is, we got the assessment, we produced the roadmap, and it informed the whole humanitarian discussion separate from it, so that your agency now thinks very firmly in terms of the need to balance and provide for the host community as well as the refugees. And this is visible, I think, in the really big initiatives which we are pushing. And I mentioned just here as a headline, public education, Lebanese public schools, the need to acquire additional funding. I mean, UNICEF are talking about around $500 million as their ask over a 3-year period, so that Lebanese schools can be equipped to accommodate more Syrian children in the public school system, but also the most vulnerable Lebanese ones, and that the Lebanese schooling system benefits permanently as a result of it. This is very much the concept now, much more. I mean, you know, if this is going to go on, I don't know how long, but to make sure that it's a sort of developmental strategy as well as a humanitarian one. That's the sort of the language that is used to explain it. And you mentioned the other thing, which was sort of kicked by the meeting in September last year, which is resettlement. I mean, other countries taking the burden, and I know that's a UNHCR priority, and it's one that Mr. Guterres, constantly reiterates, and President Suleiman has emphasized. There needs to be more done in that area. Some countries have done a little. Some have finally, like my own, recognized the need, but it's not enough by any means by way of burden sharing. Yeah.
Good. I have 4 more questions, the last of which will be Ambassador Salam. Do you mind if I go for the first 2? Yeah. So we'll start there with Jeffrey, and then the second I had was Ragida, and the third here. And then Ambassador, after those 3, will turn to you.
Yeah. Jeff Laurenti, Ambassador. If you could tell us, please, what had become of what had been the network of Syrian agents within Lebanon, now that the Syrian government has a few problems at home, presumably many of them have found a need to go back home. Has it basically, the Syrian government, subcontracted protection of its equities to Hezbollah or other actors inside the Lebanese political system? Did the deal for the interim government include any provision for trying to control the flow of people from Lebanon to aid one side or another militarily inside Syria? And what hangs over Lebanon in terms of the occasionally increasing friction between Israel and one or another Syrian faction?
Ragida?
Yeah, it's Raghida Dargham Al Haya. Just a quick follow-up before I ask my question on the issue of settlement, Derek. You and I spoke about this many times during the Beirut Institute seminars we've had on the issue of refugees. So how little work has been done, or how little reaction, how small is the reaction of these countries? How big of an effort did the UN make with countries, particularly European countries, to really help in this resettlement issue? But my question actually is about the intended presidential elections in Syria. Now, we know that Lakhdar Brahimi considered that holding such elections would, in fact, torpedo the political process of Geneva too. So what do you foresee happening to Lebanon as a result if the political process is torpedoed because of these elections? How do you see this reflecting on Lebanon? And have you spoken to the Security Council members on whether they're thinking about that, the impact of holding the elections in Syria on Lebanon? What did they say?
And then here.
Oh, sorry. Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador. Oh, Arlette Laurent. Thank you, Ambassador. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about the coordination of efforts in the broader UN family, including member states and the United Nations organizations. Thank you.
If you would answer those three, Derek, and then I'm going to call on Ambassador Salam.
Absolutely. Thank you. Well, in answer to Jeff's question, I mean, the process of government formation in Lebanon was, as I said, I think, made in Lebanon. I mean, obviously, regional and other governments have an interest in its success and might take a different view. My sense from talking to all of them was that what they wanted was an outcome. They wanted a government which could actually take decisions. So, you know, but the governments who were engaged and sort of whose voice was heard, and not voice heard, but, you know, who were talked about, would tend to be this outer circle that I've described, and then sort of key regional countries like Saudi Arabia or Iran. So I think that's the sort of context in which people tend to look at it. I don't know. I can't really comment much more on your question about, you know, the interests of the Syrian government or whatever in all of this. But my sense is that, you know, we're looking at a situation now where Lebanon is actually, Lebanese are taking their own decisions. Basically, I think that's the truth of it. But I think you are right to raise this issue about Israel, Syria, the Golan, and all of that. That is a worrying development. It's worrying because of the perception that it may have a link to events in Lebanon, at least. And certainly, you know, the volatility is, I don't know if there's a volatility, but there have been these incidents on the Blue Line. None of them, I think, or I can't think that they're necessarily linked. But there's just a sort of a greater degree of unfortunate activity, which I think one would hope would not become a trend. That's all. Sorry, it's an attempt to answer it. But I think really the important thing to say here is that it's not like it was. If you see what I mean, the question is almost sort of reflects a different era, it seems to me, in a way. May change, but that's my sense. Anyway, on the points about resettlement, where were we? Raghida. Sorry, resettlement. Well, first of all, I mean, I pay tribute to Raghida for repeated, actually, you know, really real effort here and in Beirut to raise the profile of this issue, and in the media too. I mean, really important. No, there isn't enough. I think UNHCR's target is 30,000 vulnerable persons, the most vulnerable refugees. That's why it's particularly valuable. The most vulnerable, those who are most at risk to be found homes somewhere else. And Germany took a lead. Sweden has given a lead. A number of other countries have done so. But the numbers are not what we would all hope, to be honest, but it is being carried forward. The presidential elections in Syria, I don't know. I mean, I think if the presidential elections in Syria, if they happen, with the impact that Lakhdar has described, is to undermine, he thinks, the prospects for a successful resumption of a peace negotiation. So that's his analysis. And I would defer to it. How does it immediately affect Lebanon? It's not that it has an immediate effect. It's for as long as there is not a successful peace process, Lebanon will suffer from all these problems that we have been talking about. I mean, the security problems, the humanitarian problems, the economic and social ones, they all stem from the continuation of the conflict in Syria. So if that is the impact of a presidential election in Syria, then it has an impact on Lebanon of a longer term kind. I have to confess I didn't raise it with Security Council members, but I mean, Lakhda had already very forcibly made the point. I mean, I focused in on our local agenda. But you're right. And the third question about coordination. And you might well ask the question, I'm the special coordinator. We have a resident coordinator and a humanitarian coordinator who happen to be the same person, who's also my deputy special coordinator. So there you are. I mean, the UN really does believe in coordination. And we believe also in becoming more integrated, 24 agencies, but trying to pull together. And I think we are doing that in Lebanon. The various agencies. It's very clear now. We used to have one of these old-fashioned, what they call them. You see, I'm not that sort of specialist. I'm a politico. An UNDAF, is that what it is? Adam, what do you call it? Yeah, it's all about, yeah, it's been thrown out of the window. It's all about. It's been thrown out of the window. It's all about the issues we've just been discussing. And we're all, whether it's IOM or the World Bank or anybody who's in the room, basically, they all have one concern, which is actually trying to address these challenges, including the politicos, even UNIFIL to a significant degree. There we are.
I was wondering if you had a table big enough to accommodate your UN country team.
You should come to the
Lebanon
ESCO building.
With 24. Now,
we have the facilities.
I want to say the last question for Ambassador Salam. There's one that Salva, would you like to? But please make it very quick because we're running out of time, and I want to give the ambassador his time.
Yes, of course.
Thank you. My name is Salwa Kader, and I am with the U.S. Federation for Middle East Peace. I just was wondering, since this is a long-term for the refugees, since Syria is not going to be resolved soon, I just came back from a visit to Zaatari camp in Jordan, and it seems like UNHCR seems to be very proud of what they have accomplished so far. Why wouldn't that be something that would be done in Lebanon, and is that feasible? Thank you.
Well, I mean, as Udo, who's the expert, has said, I mean, it's not, I think, UNHCR's preference to have camps of that sort. In Jordan, it's where the Jordanians wanted to go, and it does, as you tell me, it's worked. And I've seen images and stories about it which do suggest that that seems to be the case. I mean, you do have to deal with the particular context of Lebanon, the experience of Palestinian refugees and Palestinian camps, which have been there for many decades, and the concerns that people locally have about that. That's one. You look at the size of the country and then think, well, where have you got the space for a Zaatari? And then you get into difficult discussions. And it does become, it's partially a question about the political acceptability, partially the wisdom of it, and partially just where, if you were to do it. So the focus is actually, insofar as this is under discussion, it tends to be on much smaller locations, and particularly to relieve particular pressures or to get us past the really, and if you go and look at them, some of them, not all of them, but the unacceptable state of the ashwaya, the improvised camps that exist there. Locally ones, which are not properly serviced or whatever. It would be better if it was a UNHCR site, basically. But, this is very much an ongoing debate, I have to say, and as we said at a much earlier stage in this discussion, it's a decision for governments, really, the scale of these things. Thank you.
Thank you. Ambassador.
Thank you, and one more time, thank you for organizing this talk, and thank you, Derek, for your remarks. I'd like to make two remarks. The first, regarding the the figures of, with refugees. Actually, the number of registered refugees is in the 907,
978,
or 70 plus thousand. But what I always say, in reality, the number is bigger.
Much bigger. Yeah.
Much bigger.
Yeah.
For a number of obvious reasons. First, and let me be quick. First, tens of thousands in the first month did not register. There were no place where to register, and most, of the first comers were well-off Syrians who did not need a blanket or milk or any kind of similar aid. One. Two, a big number were taken care of by what, in our jargon we call community-based organizations, whether in monasteries, in religious schools, and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
So these are not accounted for in UNHCR figures. Three, and let's be also very open about it, in the first months, I would say even the first year, many were afraid of going and to register. They did not know whether they would be turned back to Syria or not. Over and above, usually we have between 200, 250,000 Syrian workers, seasonal workers, and mainly in the construction business. So over the months of the crisis, they were joined by their families, wives, children, etc. And these are not accounted for as refugees, what brings the number much higher than 1 million, unfortunately. Two, I'm happy that Derek, underlined the good news. Of course, there is a lot of good news. The work of UNSCOL in Lebanon, the role of UNIFIL in southern Lebanon, that since 2006 it has really been a very stable compared to the turbulences of the environment. But unfortunately, on balance, I would say that we have more bad news than good news. The first bad news is a political one, that the international community has failed with the big F in addressing the Syrian crisis. Two, that on the humanitarian also, of course, the international community has been very generous in making pledges, whether in Kuwait 1 or in Kuwait 2. We are all aware of the difficult financial or economic situation in the world at large, but it's important also to underline that barely 50% of the pledges were paid up, and the rest are still up in the air waiting. So on balance, unfortunately, I would tend to say that we have more bad news than good news from the international community. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Derek, we're just about through. I'd like to ask you if you'd have any final comment or saying. You don't have to.
Well, I just say keep the faith. This is, if you're here because you're interested in Lebanon, you're concerned about Lebanon. And Nawaf has said it, really. The international community, I don't agree it's failed Lebanon, but I think it's failed the region. It's failed the region. It's failed the region.
Yeah.
But at least we can try to keep Lebanon safe. And that's what's really worth doing for me. Everything else is worth doing, but this is attainable. It's within our reach. And we really need to go the extra mile. Thank you.
Derek, thank you very much. I must say, I think on behalf of the whole room, there's immense admiration for someone who would take on those series of challenges that we've described here, and doing it obviously with so much knowledge and effort. And thank you very much for sharing it with us.
Thank you.